I remain confident, more confident after Wednesday night, that the Republican nominee will not be the former president.
This disinformation ecosystem still exists, and it's still putting stress on election officials from the Secretary of State level all the way down to poll workers.
We are not personifying greatness right now. But you know what? Dad and Mom taught us it takes a few good women and men to bring about change.
Hi, I'm Scott McFarland in Washington, and welcome to America Decides. New developments tonight in the criminal cases that are increasingly complicating former President Donald Trump's 2024 campaign schedule. A judge set the trial date in the federal 2020 election conspiracy case for March 4th, 2024, one day before Super Tuesday. The former president's attorneys and prosecutors both didn't get what they asked for, but special counsel Jack Smith got close to what he sought, a trial date for January 2024. The defense had been pushing for trial in April 2026. For more on this, two heavy hitters, the All-Stars, Bob Costa and Nancy Cordes, both join us in studio today. Bob is CBS News' chief election and campaign correspondent. Nancy is CBS News' chief White House correspondent. Bob, it's early to unpack the political implications of a Election Day Eve criminal trial. What do you make of a trial one day before all those states go to vote and choose a nominee?
Scott, it's good to be with you. It's going to be a turbulent moment next year if this holds, and it actually is the beginning of the trial on the January 6th investigation by the special counsel. For former President Trump, it presents enormous challenges. But based on my conversations today with rival campaigns, it also could present a real opportunity for him to rally his own supporters around his own grievances about this investigation and other ongoing investigations.
Nancy, let me throw the same question at you. Because we're in an unprecedented moment, let's take a bigger perspective here. How do you sit in a courtroom and campaign simultaneously?
Right. I mean, let's just look at the logistics. Set the politics aside. How do you schedule rallies? How do you book venues months or weeks in advance when you don't know when you're going to have to be sitting in a courtroom or for how long you'll have to be sitting in that courtroom? Yes, his lawyers will, make motions. They threatened to do that today, to load the judge up with as many motions as possible. So it's unclear whether these trials will actually start when the judges say they will. It could get pushed back. But all of it creates an incredible atmosphere of uncertainty for the former president who wants to be a future president, but really can't nail down his plans very far in advance.
What do we get out of Georgia as this day was wrapping up, Bob? Mark Meadows, in a particularly provocative moments on the stand, answering questions from a prosecutor this early in the case. What do we know so far about it, and what implications does it have moving forward?
We see the former White House chief of staff, Mark Meadows, trying to move this case from Fulton County, Georgia, to federal court. And his lawyers have decided, his team's led by George Terwilliger, a veteran defense attorney here in Washington, that it's worth putting Meadows on the stand to answer questions about this case in the hope that the judge will be convinced to move the court to federal court, to have this setting be in federal court. For Meadows, he's making a case today in all of his answers that his work with former President Trump in the final days of the Trump administration were based around his role as chief of staff in a federal capacity. Thus, anything that's scrutinizing those actions and that conduct should be held in federal court. But as we've seen in our own reporting, there's an overlap between what happened on the federal level and what happened on the state level in late 2020 and early 2021.
And President Trump's lawyers are watching that hearing very closely because what they're hoping is that if Meadows is successful at getting his case transferred to federal court, then perhaps President Trump could do the same thing. And the end goal is, hey, maybe we get a friendly judge, maybe even a judge that former President Trump appointed to the bench. And if they can do that, then perhaps a federal judge could dismiss the case altogether. That is the hope.
At the courthouse in Washington today, you could tell the Trump attorneys were deliberately pugnacious and aggressive in their arguments, punching back at everything the judge seemed to say, potentially indicative of where that trial's going to go and how the former president would conduct himself at trial in D.C., which begs the bigger question, what type of opening does that give to his challengers, those who are running against him? Let me play some of what you said or asked and Mike Pence said yesterday on Face the Nation. Take a listen.
You were one of 6 candidates on the stage who said that you would support Mr. Trump even if he is convicted of a felony. Why do you feel that way, especially since you also said on the stage that you felt that he asked you to put him before the Constitution? Why should someone like that be president?
Well, I signed a pledge to be on that stage to say that I support the Republican nominee. I remain confident, more confident after Wednesday night, that the Republican nominee will not be the former president.
I'm going to ask you both this. Nancy, you first. Are you sensing any shift from those other contenders as these court dates stack up and these moments occur in court?
You know, I thought it was interesting that basically what he was saying, if you read between the lines, was that, well, I'm supporting former President Trump because I have to, because I signed this oath, because otherwise I couldn't get on the debate stage in the first place to make the case for my candidacy. I mean, that is sort of like the lowest level support possible that you can express for someone you spent 4 years with in the trenches. So there's clearly no love lost there. I think he has to come out after the debate. Chris Christie has to come out. All of these candidates have to come out and say that they feel some kind of momentum shift where perhaps they could gain ground on former President Trump. We have not seen that reflected on the polls, but you know, they need to give their donors and their supporters some kind of rationale to keep giving them money and to keep propelling their candidacies forward when in reality they are in the single digits and former President Trump continues to suck up all the oxygen in the race.
Same to you, Bob. You sensing any potential for some of these tectonic plates to move?
Sure. It's August of 2023. A lot can change. I remember being with then Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota in August of 2011 in Ames, Iowa. She had won what was then called the Ames straw poll, and I was on the bus with her and her husband Marcus and their son Lucas as they were celebrating this amazing moment of winning the Iowa Ames straw poll in August of 2011. Well, turns out she didn't win the Iowa caucuses. She wasn't even in the race for much longer. So what happens now can seem like it's defining, but all of these candidates know, to Nancy's great point, if they can just get traction with donors, keep traction with supporters, maybe Trump implodes or maybe they catch fire. Someone like Vivek Ramaswamy is looking at his debate performance. He's aligned with the Trump base and saying to himself, based on my reporting and his advisors, we have a shot here if we can keep capitalizing on the moments we do have, which are these debates. There will be one in late September in Los Angeles, likely one potentially in Alabama in October.
In the meantime, Kevin McCarthy keeps talking about impeachment inquiries, and his members are eager for an impeachment inquiry into President Biden and key members of the administration. What's the White House been saying about these ongoing talks about impeachment inquiries?
Today, they called it a baseless political stunt, which is not surprising. That's what you'd expect the White House to say. But the question they keep asking is impeachment inquiry for what? What evidence do you have that President Biden has done something wrong? And that is really the rub here, is that you have a lot of accusations among House Republicans, but no evidence yet that, for example, President Biden benefited financially from his son's business dealings, or that he took some kind of policy action in exchange for the money that his son was getting in his business dealings abroad. What Kevin McCarthy said this weekend was, well, if we have an impeachment inquiry, if we go to the next step, that will give us all these new legal tools. We'll be able to get evidence that we can't get now. That's not typically how it works. Typically, you move to start an impeachment inquiry because you have some significant evidence of wrongdoing. But keep in mind, McCarthy has a very restless conference, and he's facing a very difficult battle coming up in just a couple of weeks over government funding. He is pushing to continue government funding just for the short term, and he knows that there are conservatives who are not going to go along with that, who don't like it. And so this can be viewed, I think, as him kind of throwing a bone to them, saying, look, you know, I know you want an impeachment inquiry. I might be on board for that, but I'm going to need you to be on board to keep the lights on, because no one wants to see a government shutdown.
Yeah, just 4 weeks away from that deadline, because as always, summer just disappears so quickly. Nancy Cordes, Bob Costa, thank you both.
Thank you.
So, how safe are our election institutions as we approach 2024? We'll talk to our CBS News election law expert coming up. You're streaming America Decides.
I don't want to go anywhere. I second guess everything that I do. It's affecting my life in a major way, all because of lies, for me doing my job.
We just followed the law, we followed the Constitution, and at the end of the day, President Trump came up short.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was just some of the dramatic testimony during the House Select Committee's investigation into January 6th last year. And nearly a year later, President Trump will be scheduled to stand trial March 4th for his federal election interference case. CBS News election law expert and political contributor David Becker joins us now. David's executive director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research. David, so today we get a trial date of March 4th, which, as we've mentioned, is the day before Super Tuesday, but it also puts a trial and potential defenses that the 2020 election was rigged right in the middle of electing primary nominees, in the middle of some voting in some states. What's the risk of having these baseless election claims prominent again as people go back to vote?
Well, I think there's both a risk and an opportunity here. As Judge Chutkan pointed out, to both counsel, we often portray this as there are two parties and the two parties are adversaries in this. But she pointed out there's a very important third party in this, and that's the public, the American citizens. And they have an interest in a full trial that's held fairly closely to the indictment as well. And in particular, in this instance, this is going to be right in the middle of the primary process, as you pointed out. And so this is an opportunity for the American people to also learn about any claims that the defendant might make that either didn't know that he was wrong about the election being stolen or that the election was actually stolen. We sit here well over 1,000 days since that election. And despite repeated promises, that evidence that supposedly exists that the election was stolen has never been presented to any court or law enforcement agency. It has never materialized in any way. And this is an opportunity for the defendant to put those before a court and have those pieces of so-called evidence scrutinized. We recall a couple of weeks ago where they were supposed to release a supposedly irrefutable report. That never materialized. So this is an opportunity for him to make his case, not just to the court, but to the American people in the middle of a primary process that he was right all along. And of course, and also an opportunity for the prosecution to present that there is no such evidence and he was wrong all along and guilty of those charges.
But here we are, nearly 4 years later, and there's still baseless claims coming from Trump in advance of these trials and these criminal hearings. You talk to secretaries of state and election administrators. Are they still getting that? Are they still hearing from their constituents that they believe they were robbed in 2020? Are they still skeptical about what happens next year?
They're not only still hearing that over 1,000 days after the election, in some ways that's ramped up recently as some extremists have doubled down on the rhetoric, on the lies. I've still seen lies just this past weekend spread that there were more voters in some states than there were people. That's not only false, it's demonstrably false, and it's very easy to disprove. There was no state where they even came close to having 100% turnout or 90% turnout of eligible voters, even though we had very high turnout of about 2/3 of eligible voters nationally. So this disinformation ecosystem still exists, and it's still putting stress on election officials from the Secretary of State level all the way down to poll workers. We should remember that one of the key claims in the Georgia indictments are the false claims being made about a volunteer poll worker, Ruby Freeman, that ended up upending her life. And she is still suffering the effects of that to this day. I can tell you from talking to election officials all over the country, that persists, and if anything, is ramping up.
In addition to the threats, which are, by your accounts and by so many accounts, increasing, what other wrenches do these election deniers throw into the system for election administrators? What other challenges are they facing trying to administer these elections during an increasing amount of election denialism?
Well, you see, for instance, there are claims made about election security that are false, and they lead to bad policy choices that make it harder for election officials to run secure elections. So a great example of this is there are efforts in several places around the country where election deniers have convinced government officials in certain counties that the only way to actually determine the outcome of an election is through hand counting of ballots. And the problem with that is hand counting is actually well documented and proven to be less accurate, more costly, and much slower than machine counting. And machine counting also has to be verified through audits and recounts, and it is in all of the states. But those efforts to impose hand counting, you can imagine what that does to election offices, where they have to recruit more people, they have to spend more money, and then there's going to be a longer period of time where the loser of the election could incite anger and possibly violence. These things are very much a concern as we head into 2024.
That's been a component of this Fulton County case, David, that's been distinctive from the start, that among the co-defendants are people accused of pressuring or seeking to pressure these local poll workers in Fulton County. Some of the defendants are from Chicago, accused of going to Fulton County to pressure election workers. How rare a case is this? Is there a lot of muscle memory for prosecuting people for trying to pressure election poll workers, or is this in itself unprecedented?
It is unprecedented. I get that question sometimes, and like, when was the last time this happened? And I have to say, it's never happened. Could you imagine a losing candidate finding these volunteer poll workers, the best of us, the citizens who volunteer hours and hours of their day, not just on election day, but often for training weeks in advance and through early voting, who don't get paid very much if they get paid at all, and traveling across state lines to threaten and harass them? And that's what happened in Georgia in 2020, and even in some other places as well. And we saw online and even physical harassment of election officials in Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin and many other places. This has never happened before. The biggest problem for election officials in our country prior to 2020 was anonymity, that most people didn't understand what they did or who they were, and they had a hard time explaining it to their friends and families, the hard work of election administration on a day-to-day basis. And now they're being targeted not because they did a bad job in 2020, but because they did a remarkable job in 2020, somehow managing the highest turnout that the United States has ever seen in the middle of a global pandemic, and they're still suffering the effects of that harassment to this day.
One thing I'll note, being in the courthouse today, the prosecutors were arguing for that prompt trial here in Washington, D.C. They said in so many words that conspiracy theories about the election persist, and that is a reason why they want to move swiftly to trial to avoid the jury pool being tainted and those baseless claims from metastasizing any further. Your research, your conversations indicate that those baseless claims are nevertheless metastasizing even as we get further away from 2020.
Well, I think she's right, though. She's really talking about a target audience here, which is the jury pool in D.C., and she's appropriately concerned about that pool being tainted to some degree in either direction, because this kind of disinformation doesn't always manifest itself with effects that you would always expect. It also has a lot of pushback at times. And so she's quite right to try to minimize that as much as she can. Obviously, she's going to be keeping a close eye on what the defendant says publicly, and any overt attempts to influence the jury pool or also threaten anyone involved in the proceedings. And it's pretty clear that the defendant's counsel is going to have a hard time keeping him in line on some of those things. And we're going to have to watch this very closely as it proceeds.
As we get real close to a trial date, less than 7 months away. David Becker, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Scott.
Today marks 60 years since Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders led the March on Washington. The Library of Congress on Capitol Hill holds a number of artifacts from the march. Our Willie Inman gets a tour next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Today marks 60 years since the March on Washington. It was August 28, 1963, when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech to a crowd of about 250,000 people. That speech and the mementos from that day are forever immortalized in the Library of Congress. CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman joins us now outside the Library of Congress. Hey, Willie.
Hey there, Scott. Good to be with you. That's right. It was 60 years ago that Martin Luther King Jr. gave that famous I Have a Dream speech. And many people know that moment. But what a lot of folks don't know is those behind the scenes who made that moment a reality.
It's been 60 years since some 250,000 people marched on Washington for equal rights.
I have a dream today.
The National Mall remains hallowed ground for the movement, but the story of that day also lives on through the items left behind.
What was the march really about?
The march started as a really demonstration to bring it home in Washington, D.C., that African Americans in particular needed equal employment, more opportunities for jobs. You were seeing the original documents.
Dr. Carla Hayden is the Librarian of Congress. The institution is the largest of its kind in the world, and it houses things like rare books, presidential papers, and historical documents like these from the Civil Rights Movement. The library's collection includes pictures and programs from the August 1963 event.
This is planning. This is so much. Here, the brochures that were sent out.
Looks almost like a playbill kind of.
Right, saying here it is, here's what we're going to do.
And you have like drawers and drawers.
Drawers and drawers.
Look how well they were dressed as well.
Very well dressed, because that was also in the handbook.
There are also detailed logistical notes written by Bayard Rustin, an activist who worked alongside A. Philip Randolph, one of the key architects of the March on Washington. Hayden says many of the unsung heroes of the event were women.
They might not realize that there were a number of women who were helping with the organization. They weren't allowed to speak. Rosa Parks was invited and she stood there, but women were behind quite a bit of the organizing and what was going on that day.
Perhaps the crown jewel of the artifacts from that time is a typed and copyright stamped transcript of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech.
If you had a lesson or you had a note to give to people who could potentially visit here, what would you say?
Get hope from history. Look at what has happened before, and you will be able to see that there's a way to take the lessons from the past so you can make a better future.
And Scott, it's really those tactile reminders from years long ago that remind us of what happened and how far we've come. And it really is interesting visiting the Library of Congress. I got a behind-the-scenes look. I also got schooled on a bit. Dr. Carla Hayden, she told me, she explained essentially that Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, the portion that he talks about that dream, was an impromptu moment. It was really essentially prompted by Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer that was standing a little bit behind him. She prompted him to talk about the dream, which she heard about months ago. And it was then that he went on into that memorable moment. Scott?
Tell me about this op-ed President Biden wrote about the 60th anniversary of the march.
Yeah, that's right. Today, the president essentially touted this op-ed. His spokesperson, I should say, Karine Jean-Pierre, they essentially talked about the undelivered promise to individuals across this country, especially those Black individuals. The op-ed was titled, "We Must Keep Marching Towards King's Dream." And President Biden essentially talks about trickle-down economics and how it's failed people across this country, including Black folks across this country as well. He talks about what his administration has done, what they see as successes, the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, all the economic policies that the president and, as he mentions, the vice president have brought about in this country, how they can help people across this nation. But I can tell you, Scott, and you know this as well, being on the campaign trail and talking to folks out there, they don't always see those promises and those essentially those bills being delivered to them in terms of how they feel about this president. Scott?
That's right. Willie James Inman, thank you. That does it for today. Stream America Decides, Monday to Thursday at 5 Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.